There is something underneath the streets of every major Canadian city that the history books refuse to explain. Not sewage pipes, not bedrock, not the rusting bones of old transit tunnels. Structures, artifacts, evidence of lives lived at a scale and with a sophistication that directly contradicts the version of Canadian history most people were taught in school. In 1535, when Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River and landed near what is now Montreal, he described something remarkable in his journals. He didn't describe a wilderness. He didn't describe empty forest. He described a city, a functioning, organized, densely populated city called Hochelaga, surrounded by fields of corn that stretched to the horizon, protected by a triple-walled palisade, and home to an estimated 1,500 people. He walked its streets. He was greeted by its leaders. He marveled at its organization. By the time Samuel de Champlain arrived in the same location 70 years later, Hochelaga was completely gone. Not abandoned, not burned, not gradually emptied. Gone. Erased. Vanished so completely that even the people Champlain spoke to in the area had no memory of it. Historians have spent 5 centuries arguing about where Hochelaga actually stood, what happened to it, and why none of its physical structure has ever been definitively found. The leading candidate for its location is the campus of McGill University in downtown Montreal, one of Canada's most prestigious academic institutions, sitting on top of one of Canadian history's greatest mysteries, and conducting almost no serious excavation of the ground beneath its own feet. This is not a coincidence, and Hochelaga is not an isolated case. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It does not require shadowy government agencies or secret suppression campaigns, though some of what happened does involve deliberate erasure. What it requires is something more uncomfortable. An honest reckoning with the fact that Canadian history, as it has been taught for generations, begins far too late, ends far too early, and leaves out the most important parts. The evidence is still there, under Toronto, under Vancouver, under Ottawa and Winnipeg and Quebec City, under the parking lots and universities and government buildings of every major Canadian city. Ground-penetrating radar surveys are now finding structures nobody has excavated. LiDAR mapping from aircraft is revealing the ghostly outlines of villages and earthworks and agricultural systems that official history insists did not exist. DNA from ancient remains is telling a migration story that collapses the simple narrative of who was here and when. What you are about to hear spans 12,000 years. It involves civilizations that built cities, maintained trade networks that stretched from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, mined copper on a scale that supplied the entire eastern continent for millennia, and maintained democratic governance systems so sophisticated that historians now believe they directly inspired the framers of the American Constitution. And virtually none of it is in the textbooks. Stay with this, because by the end, the Canada you think you know will not exist anymore. What will exist instead is something far older, far more complex, and far more extraordinary. What's actually under your city? Before we go back in time, let's start with something concrete, something you can look up, something that is happening right now in the cities you live in or near that most people have never heard about. In 2021, construction crews breaking ground on a condo development in downtown Toronto hit something they didn't expect. About 2 meters below street level, they found the remnants of a wooden structure carbonized timbers, and fire-hardened clay, consistent with Indigenous longhouse construction from somewhere between 800 and 1200 years ago. The discovery required a pause in construction. An archaeologist was brought in, assessed the find, and submitted a report. The project was eventually allowed to continue. The structure was photographed, partially catalogued, and then largely destroyed by the construction that followed. This is not unusual. It happens dozens of times per year across Canada. The legal framework requires that archaeologically significant finds be reported. It does not require that they be fully excavated, fully studied, or that the public be meaningfully informed. The default outcome, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is documentation followed by destruction. Ask most Canadians what is under their city. They will tell you they don't know. They have never been given reason to think about it. The school curriculum, the public history infrastructure, the museums and heritage sites and tourist information, all of it operates as though Canadian history effectively begins in the 16th century, with a brief acknowledgement that Indigenous people existed, followed by the arrival of Europeans and the subsequent story of colonization and nationhood. The problem with this version of history is that it is not supported by the physical evidence. Archaeological surveys conducted along the Don Valley in Toronto have identified human habitation sites dating back at least 11,000 years, to the period immediately following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. The city of Toronto does not rest on empty land recently arrived at. It rests on more than 100 centuries of continuous human habitation. The cultures that lived there, traded there, built there, and died there left things behind. Those things are still in the ground. Some of them have been found. Most have not been looked for. In Vancouver, development along the Fraser River Delta regularly uncovers shell middens, compressed deposits of shellfish remains, animal bones, tools, and organic material that represent thousands of years of permanent settlement. Some of these middens extend to depths of 4 meters or more. They contain material dating back 6,000 years. The communities that produced them were not small, mobile hunting bands. They were permanent settlements with architecture, seasonal food storage systems, and long-distance trade relationships evidenced by obsidian tools sourced from volcanic deposits in present-day Oregon and California. In Winnipeg, the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers has been a major human gathering point for at least 6,000 years. The site, now occupied by the Forks National Historic Site, has been partially excavated and is understood to contain significant archaeological material. The excavations that have been conducted represent a tiny fraction of what the site likely holds. Most of the ground at the Forks has never been systematically examined. The pattern repeats itself in every major Canadian city, not because nothing is there, but because the institutional infrastructure for excavating, studying, and publicizing what is there has never been adequately built, adequately funded, or adequately prioritized. And that failure has not been accidental. To understand why the evidence is buried and why it stays buried, you need to understand what the evidence actually shows. Because what it shows is not simply that Indigenous people were here before Europeans. Everyone knows that, at least nominally. What it shows is far more specific and far more destabilizing than that. It shows that before European contact, this land held civilizations that were not primitive, not simple, and not static. They were sophisticated, organized, politically complex, and in some cases, they were building and maintaining urban-scale settlements that rival anything that was happening in Europe at the same time. This is what is buried. Not just the physical artifacts, the understanding. The copper culture, 5,000 years of industrial mining. Begin here because it is the oldest and the most physically verifiable, and because it represents a scale of organized activity that has no place in the standard Canadian historical narrative. On the shores of Lake Superior, particularly on the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royal, there are mines. Not modern mines, ancient ones. Holes in the ground, driven into copper-bearing rock, that were worked by human hands using stone tools over a period spanning approximately 5,000 years, from around 3000 BCE to around 1200 CE. The volume of copper extracted from these sites has been estimated at somewhere between 1.5 billion and 500 billion pounds, depending on the methodology used for the calculation. Even the most conservative estimates represent a quantity of refined metal that makes no sense if we are talking about small bands of hunter-gatherers occasionally picking up pretty rocks. The copper extracted from Lake Superior shows up throughout North America. It has been found at burial sites in present-day Louisiana, Ohio, Illinois, Georgia, and as far afield as the Gulf of Mexico coast. Copper breastplates, copper tools, copper ornaments, copper weapons. Analysis of the metal's isotopic composition, its geological fingerprint, consistently traces it back to Lake Superior deposits. This means there existed, for at least 3,000 years, a continental trade network capable of moving tons of refined metal from northern Ontario and Michigan to the Gulf of Mexico and back again. A trade network of this kind does not operate without organization. It requires people who know the routes, who maintain relationships along the routes, who can guarantee safe passage, who understand the value differential between what is abundant in one place and scarce in another. It requires, in other words, something that functions at least partially like commerce. And commerce at scale requires social structures, sophisticated enough to support it. The people responsible for this trade network are referred to by archaeologists as the Old Copper Complex. Almost nothing about them is in the standard history curriculum. Their timeline of activity puts them contemporaneous with the earliest Egyptian dynasties, with Stonehenge, with the Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean. While the pyramids of Giza were being planned and built, people in what is now northern Ontario were running a continental copper mining and distribution operation that supplied metal tools and luxury goods to cultures across an entire continent. The reason this doesn't feature prominently in Canadian or American history is partly a function of timing. Much of the serious archaeological work on this topic was done in the latter half of the 20th century, too late to influence the fundamental narratives already embedded in textbooks and curricula. But it is also, at least in part, a function of a stubborn tendency in Western historical thinking to reserve the vocabulary of civilization, trade, industry, commerce, organization, for cultures that left stone monuments and written records. The Old Copper Complex left neither. What they left was functional: tools, weapons, objects of trade and ceremony. Because these objects don't look like pyramids or cathedrals, they have historically been undervalued as evidence of a complex and organized society. The mining sites themselves tell a different story. The pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula are not the work of opportunistic collectors. They are systematic. They follow the copper veins. They show evidence of coordinated effort, multiple workers operating in the same pit, wooden props used to shore up excavations, evidence of heating rock with fire to make it easier to break, wooden bowls used to bail out water, This is industrial mining, 5,000 years ago, in what is now Canada and the northern United States. And it stopped. Around 1200 CE, the mining activity seems to have declined sharply. No one is entirely certain why. Climate change is one possibility. The medieval warm period created new agricultural opportunities that may have shifted the economic priorities of the Great Lakes cultures. Social disruption is another. Whatever the cause, the industrial copper mining of Lake Superior essentially ended, and the continent-wide trade network it had anchored, fragmented, and transformed. But not before it shaped everything that came after it. The Hopewell culture of Ohio, which flourished from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, was built in significant part on the copper trade from the Great Lakes. The Mississippian culture, which built the city of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, with a population at its peak estimated at 15 to 20,000 people, maintained trade connections that ran all the way to the Great Lakes. Canada's ancient copper mines were not a regional curiosity. They were an economic engine for an entire continent. None of this is in the history books your children are reading. Hochelaga, the city that disappeared. Now we come to the story that perhaps best illustrates how the rewriting of Canadian history worked in practice. Because this is not ancient history. This is not 12,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago. This happened in the 16th century, which is recent enough that European written records exist, which is precisely why what happened to Hochelaga is so extraordinary. Jacques Cartier first encountered Hochelaga on October 2nd, 1535. He recorded the visit in his journal in considerable detail. The settlement was located at the foot of a mountain, which he named Mont Royal, the origin of the name Montreal. He described a village surrounded by 3 concentric wooden palisades, circular in plan, with a single entrance. Inside the walls were approximately 50 longhouses, each roughly 50 meters long, housing multiple family groups. The total population was probably between 1,500 and 2,000 people. The residents cultivated corn in fields surrounding the palisade. The settlement was, by any reasonable standard, a city. Cartier was received there. He spoke with leaders. He was shown around. His journals describe the interaction with curiosity and some admiration. Hochelaga was clearly a functioning, complex, politically organized community, not a temporary encampment or a collection of scattered family groups. 73 years later, Samuel de Champlain arrived in the same area. He found no trace of Hochelaga. He found no city, no palisade, no fields, no population. He found a largely empty landscape, with scattered bands of Algonquin-speaking people who, when he asked about the city Cartier had described, did not seem to know what he was talking about, or perhaps more precisely, would not tell him what they knew. The disappearance of Hochelaga is one of Canadian history's genuine, unsolved mysteries. The most common explanations involve epidemic disease, European pathogens that spread ahead of European arrival, decimating populations that had no immunity, combined with Iroquoian warfare, which was intensifying during this period as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy consolidated its power south of the St. Lawrence. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that Hochelaga was destroyed in warfare and its survivors dispersed, and that European-introduced disease had already significantly weakened the community before the attack came. But the specific location of Hochelaga has never been confirmed. The physical remains of the city, the charred longhouse timbers, the cultural material, the middens, the burials, must be somewhere. Cities don't disappear without leaving a trace. What they leave is a physical layer, a stratum in the ground that speaks to occupation, to fire, to habitation, to death. The Hochelaga layer is in the ground somewhere in Montreal. The leading candidate for its location, based on Cartier's own description and subsequent historical analysis, is the area around McGill University on the slopes of Mount Royal. The university campus was developed beginning in the early 19th century, and at that time, construction workers did occasionally find artifacts, human remains, and structural evidence of indigenous occupation. Most of this material was not systematically collected or studied. Much of it was discarded. In the 1990s, renewed interest in the question led to a series of archaeological investigations around the McGill campus and surrounding neighborhood. These investigations found some evidence of pre-contact indigenous occupation, but did not definitively identify the location of Hochelaga. The investigations were limited in scope, restricted to areas where access could be obtained, and could not fully penetrate the centuries of urban development that had altered the landscape. The ground under McGill University has never been comprehensively surveyed. The institution sits, quite literally, on what may be the single most historically significant archaeological site in Canada, the location of the largest pre-contact indigenous city in the northeastern part of the continent, and it has never made the excavation of that history a priority. There is something almost painfully symbolic about this. McGill University is named for James McGill, a Scottish fur trader who made his fortune in the colonial enterprise. The land his estate occupied, and which he bequeathed to create the university, was Haudenosaunee territory. The possibility that the physical remains of Hochelaga lie beneath the university's foundations is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of how Canadian history was constructed, by building on top of what came before, burying it under institutions and infrastructure, and declaring the construction complete. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the democracy that predated everything. If what happened to Hochelaga represents history being erased by violence and disease, then the story of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy represents history being erased by something subtler and in some ways more insidious, by being acknowledged but never fully credited, understood but never fully taught. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, or the League of the Five Nations, later Six Nations, is the oldest living democracy on Earth. This is not a claim that requires qualification or hedging. It is historically supported, archaeologically documented, and accepted by serious scholars across multiple disciplines. The Confederacy was founded sometime between the 12th and 15th centuries CE, with the oral tradition of the member nations placing its founding as early as 1142 CE, based on a solar eclipse described in the founding narrative that astronomers have been able to date. It predates the Magna Carta. It predates the first stirrings of English parliamentary democracy. It predates every formal democratic constitutional system in the Western world. The Confederacy's founding document, the Great Law of Peace, Gayanashagoa in the Onondaga language, is a sophisticated constitutional framework that establishes rules for governance, conflict resolution, decision-making, the rights of individuals, the rights of nations within the Confederacy, and the mechanisms by which the Confederacy can expand to include new member nations. It establishes a bicameral-style council structure with two houses, balances power between nations of different sizes, includes mechanisms for removing leaders who abuse their power, protects individual rights against arbitrary authority, and reserves specific governing roles for women in a way that no European political system would for centuries. The extent to which the Great Law of Peace influenced the American Founding Fathers is a subject of legitimate historical debate, but the evidence is substantial. In 1744, Onondaga chief Kanasatego explicitly advised the delegates of the British colonies to form a union similar to the Haudenosaunee model. His speech was published in Benjamin Franklin's printing house in Philadelphia and was widely read. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were both documented admirers of Haudenosaunee political structures. The 1754 Albany Plan of Union, which Franklin drafted and which became a precursor to the Articles of Confederation, bears structural similarities to the Haudenosaunee Council system. In 1988, the United States Congress formally acknowledged in Senate Resolution 331 that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had influenced the framers of the American Constitution. The implications of this are significant. The foundational document of the world's most powerful democracy has roots in an indigenous North American political system that was functioning and sophisticated for centuries before European contact. This is not taught in standard Canadian or American history curricula in any meaningful way. The Founding Fathers are credited with inventing American democracy. The indigenous political tradition that contributed to it is treated as background noise, if it is mentioned at all. In Canada, the Haudenosaunee occupy a particularly complex historical position. Their traditional territory spans the border between present-day Ontario and New York State, a border that they never recognized and still do not recognize. They have maintained a separate Haudenosaunee passport issued by the Confederacy since the 1920s, and there are ongoing legal and diplomatic disputes about the status of Haudenosaunee sovereignty that the Canadian government has never fully resolved. The erasure of Haudenosaunee history in Canadian schools is not simply an omission. It is a consequence of choices made at the highest levels of Canadian government, going back to Confederation and before. Choices about whose history counted, whose political systems deserved study, whose governance models were worth understanding. Canada modeled its parliamentary system on Britain. It studied Greek and Roman democracy. It did not study, and does not teach, the governance system of the people who had been practicing sophisticated democracy within its own borders for centuries before any European arrived. The Vikings, and what L'Anse aux Meadows doesn't tell you. In 1960, a Norwegian husband and wife explorer team, Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad, identified the archaeological remains of a Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavations confirmed what the Ingstads suspected. The site dated to approximately 1000 CE, making it the oldest confirmed European presence in North America, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. L'Anse aux Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is, in the pantheon of Canadian historical discoveries, about as official and publicly acknowledged as anything gets. The Vikings were here. We know it. We celebrate it. But the full story of the Norse presence in North America, and what it tells us about the complexity of pre-Columbian contact with Canada, is considerably more interesting than the standard heritage site version. L'Anse aux Meadows is not a permanent colony. It is, based on the archaeological evidence, an outpost, a base camp, a way station. The structures found there, 3 large multi-room buildings, 2 smaller structures, and several outbuildings, housed perhaps 60 to 90 people. The site shows evidence of iron smelting, boat repair, and woodworking. It was occupied for a relatively short period, probably between 3 and 10 years, and then abandoned. The Norse sagas that describe the exploration of Vinland, the name the Norse gave to the North American lands they encountered, describe not one but multiple voyages, covering a larger territory than just the northern tip of Newfoundland. The Vinland sagas describe interactions with indigenous people, called skraelings in the sagas, describe grapevines, which don't grow in Newfoundland, describe winters milder than Iceland's. The evidence strongly suggests the Norse explored significantly further south and west than L'Anse aux Meadows. Some researchers have proposed that the Norse traveled as far south as the St. Lawrence, possibly further. What does this mean? It means that 500 years before Columbus, Europeans were not just touching the coast of North America. They were exploring it. They were interacting with its inhabitants, trading with them, fighting with them, and possibly establishing relationships that left genetic and cultural traces that we have not yet fully identified. The Norse left L'Anse aux Meadows, but there is no particular reason to believe they went home and told no one, or that subsequent generations made no further voyages. The sagas describe the abandonment of Vinland as a consequence of conflicts with indigenous people becoming too dangerous, not as a consequence of the land being unknown or inaccessible. More recently, the discovery of Norse artifacts at a site on Baffin Island, far to the north of L'Anse aux Meadows, has extended the documented range of Norse activity in North America and suggested that Norse and Dorset culture people had sustained contact over a significant period. The Dorset people were the inhabitants of the Arctic regions of Canada before the arrival of the Thule culture that eventually became the Inuit. The evidence of contact between them and the Norse raises questions about the transmission of technology, the exchange of knowledge, and the degree to which the Arctic routes between Europe and North America were better known and more regularly traveled in the medieval period than the standard historical narrative acknowledges. The story of European contact with Canada does not begin with Cabot in 1497 or Cartier in 1534. It begins, at the latest, in 1000 CE, and the evidence now suggests it may have been ongoing, episodic, and more complex than a single event for decades or centuries after L'Anse aux Meadows was abandoned. The Beothuk, a people erased twice. The Beothuk people of Newfoundland are, in Canadian historical memory, primarily associated with their extinction. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanadithit, died in 1829 in St. John's, having spent the last years of her life in the custody of a well-meaning Newfoundland businessman who was documenting what remained of her language and culture. She was approximately 28 years old. With her death, the Beothuk ceased to exist as a living people. The story of how the Beothuk were destroyed is one of the most disturbing chapters in Canadian history, and it is almost never told in full. The short version offered in most educational settings is that the Beothuk were decimated by disease and displacement after European settlement of Newfoundland. This is true, but it is incomplete. What the abbreviated version leaves out is that the Beothuk were also hunted. Not metaphorically, not incidentally. Literally hunted for sport and bounty by European settlers who viewed them as a nuisance, a threat, or simply as legitimate game. European settlers in Newfoundland organized hunting parties to kill Beothuk people. There are documented accounts of Beothuk men, women, and children being shot for amusement. The British colonial government's attempts to make such killings illegal were largely ineffective because prosecution required witnesses willing to testify, and the settler community had no interest in providing them. The Beothuk retreated from the coast, where they had traditional access to marine resources, into the interior of Newfoundland, where the food resources were inadequate to support them. They died of starvation, disease, and continued violence over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries, until Shanadithit was the last one left. This is the first erasure, the physical erasure of a people. The second erasure is subtler. The Beothuk, before contact, were not a small or primitive population. Archaeological evidence from Newfoundland indicates that the island was extensively occupied, with Beothuk or pre-Beothuk people maintaining complex seasonal patterns of resource use, combining marine hunting in summer with caribou hunting in the interior in winter. They used red ochre extensively in ceremony and burial practice, which is how they came to be called the Red Indians by early European observers, a label that was subsequently applied generically to all indigenous people in North America, erasing the specific Beothuk origin of the description. The pre-contact population of Beothuk in Newfoundland has been estimated at between 500 and 2,000 people, which may seem small, but reflects the resource constraints of an island environment rather than any cultural simplicity. What is less appreciated is the extent to which the Beothuk maintained connections to a broader network of northeastern Algonquian-speaking cultures, and to the rich marine environment of Newfoundland's coasts and the Grand Banks. The destruction of the Beothuk did not just eliminate a people, it eliminated an entire accumulated body of knowledge about the ecology of Newfoundland. Knowledge about fish runs, seal migrations, caribou routes, medicinal plants, weather patterns, and navigation that took thousands of years to accumulate and vanished in a century. The physical evidence of Beothuk occupation, burial sites, food storage caches, winter camp locations, boat building sites, is scattered across Newfoundland in quantities that have never been comprehensively surveyed. What has been found and studied represents a tiny fraction of the physical record. The second erasure continues. In the absence of a living community to advocate for the preservation and study of Beothuk archaeological sites, the institutional urgency to excavate and understand them has never fully materialized. The Mississippian Shadow, Cahokia's reach into Canada. Most Canadians have never heard of Cahokia. Most Americans haven't either, which tells you something important about whose history gets told and whose doesn't. Cahokia was a city, a genuine, large-scale, urban settlement located at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers near present-day St. Louis. At its peak, around 1100 CE, it had a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people, larger than London at the same time. It was built around a central platform mound, Monk's Mound, that remains the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, covering more ground area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city was planned. It had a grid layout. It had public spaces, residential neighborhoods, specialized craft production areas, storage facilities, and what appears to have been a central plaza used for large public gatherings and ceremonies. Cahokia was not a Canadian city, but it was connected to Canada, and the nature of that connection illustrates something crucial about the pre-contact history of the North American continent that is almost entirely absent from Canadian historical education. The Mississippian culture that built and sustained Cahokia maintained trade relationships that extended throughout eastern North America. Copper from Lake Superior, Canadian copper, found its way to Cahokia in substantial quantities. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico appeared alongside Great Lakes materials in Cahokia burials. The trade network that moved these materials was continental in scope, stretching from the Canadian Shield to the Gulf Coast, and from the Great Plains to the Atlantic seaboard. What this means for Canadian history is that the cultures of what is now Canada were, for centuries, participating in a continental economic system of significant scale and complexity. The woodland cultures of Ontario and Quebec, the ancestors of many of the nations encountered by European explorers, were not isolated. They were nodes in a network. They were producing goods, copper, furs, specific types of stone tools, marine and freshwater shells, that were valued across the continent and that moved through established trade routes maintained by relationships of diplomacy, kinship, and commerce. The people running the Canadian end of these networks were not simple. They were traders, diplomats, and political actors operating in a sophisticated continental economy. The European fur trade, which is typically presented as the beginning of meaningful economic activity in Canada, was in fact simply a transformation of an already existing trade infrastructure. The routes the French and English used for the fur trade were indigenous trade routes. The diplomatic protocols they followed were adaptations of indigenous diplomatic traditions. The economic logic of the fur trade, the exchange of European manufactured goods for North American natural resources, was a European overlay on a trade system that had been operating in various forms for 3,000 years. When the fur trade is described in Canadian history as the founding economic activity of the country, what is being described is actually the colonization of an existing economy. The rewriting of who built that economy and when and how is not just a historical injustice. It is a fundamental misrepresentation of the origins of Canada as an economic and political entity. What's buried under Toronto? Let's get specific, because the abstract argument that Canada's history has been rewritten becomes more powerful and more visceral when you can stand on a street corner in a city you know and say, "Here. It happened here." Toronto sits at the mouth of the Humber River on the north shore of Lake Ontario. This is, by any measure, prime real estate. It is the easiest lake access point from the southern Great Lakes to the northern waterways that lead to the interior of the continent. The Toronto Carrying Place, a portage route connecting Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe, and from there to the upper Great Lakes and the Georgian Bay, was one of the most important travel corridors in northeastern North America for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. People have been at the mouth of the Humber River for a very long time. The earliest confirmed human presence dates to approximately 11,000 years ago, immediately after the retreat of the glaciers. The people who were there first were not Haudenosaunee or Mississauga. Those nations arrived in the region much later, within the last few thousand years. The people who arrived first were Paleo-Indians, hunter-gatherers following the leading edge of the habitable landscape as the glaciers retreated, hunting megafauna that are now extinct and living in a landscape that looked nothing like the temperate forest that would eventually establish itself. Over the following 10,000 years, the human occupation of the Toronto area was continuous and dynamic. Different cultures arrived, flourished, and were succeeded by others. Archaeological evidence from around the Don River, the Humber River, and the lakeshore shows a succession of occupations through the Archaic period, the Woodland period, and the Late Woodland period, with evidence of trade, warfare, ceremonial activity, and long-term habitation at every stage. The Late Woodland period in the Toronto area, roughly 1000 CE to 1500 CE, is particularly interesting because it represents the period of maximum complexity in terms of settlement patterns and political organization. During this period, the cultures of southern Ontario were building large, semi-permanent villages surrounded by palisades, essentially fortified towns, and engaging in the kind of intensive agricultural production, using corn and beans and squash that supported dense populations. Archaeological surveys around the Toronto region have identified dozens of sites from this period: village locations, burial grounds, processing sites, and evidence of the elaborate social and ceremonial life of these communities. What lies under the modern city of Toronto is the accumulated physical record of 10 or 11,000 years of human occupation. The question is not whether there are archaeological remains under Toronto's streets. Of course there are. The question is how much of the record has survived, what has been found, and what has been destroyed. The honest answer is that a great deal has been destroyed. Toronto grew rapidly in the 19th century, and that growth involved digging foundations, grading streets, diverting waterways, and removing the topsoil across large areas of the city without systematic archaeological study. The Don River was channelized, its natural meandering course replaced by a straight, concrete channel, a process that destroyed an immense amount of archaeological material along its banks. The waterfront was radically altered by lake filling, adding land area to the city, but obliterating the original shoreline and the archaeological record it contained. What has been found, through chance discovery and targeted excavation, is significant enough to suggest that what has not been found is even more significant. Human burials have been uncovered at construction sites across the city, sometimes in groups large enough to suggest burial grounds of real importance. Artifact assemblages from various periods of occupation have appeared during basement excavations, sewer projects, and utility work. Features consistent with longhouse construction have been identified in multiple locations. The most significant archaeological discovery in modern Toronto's history occurred not in the downtown core, but in the Tabor Hill area of Scarborough, now part of the eastern city. In the late 1950s, during housing development, workers uncovered a large ossuary, a communal burial site, containing the remains of hundreds of individuals. The site dated to approximately 1250 CE. The remains and associated artifacts represented a community of significant size that had occupied the area for a substantial period. The discovery attracted some academic attention, a degree of public interest, and then was largely forgotten. The housing development proceeded. The site is now a small park, Tabor Hill Park, with a plaque that most residents of the surrounding neighborhood have never read. This is the story of Toronto's buried history in miniature. Discovery, brief attention, insufficient study, continuation of the development that prompted the discovery in the first place. The pattern is not malicious. It is institutional. It reflects a set of priorities in which the requirements of ongoing urban development consistently outweigh the requirements of historical preservation, and in which the public has not been given sufficient information to push back against those priorities. Vancouver's vanished villages. What happened to the pre-contact settlements of the Vancouver area is different from what happened in Toronto, and it is perhaps more illustrative of the specific mechanisms by which Indigenous history was deliberately removed from public consciousness. The area now occupied by the city of Vancouver was, before contact, one of the most densely populated regions north of Mexico. This is not an exaggeration. The combination of mild climate, abundant marine resources, rich riverine fisheries, and extensive forest resources made the south coast of British Columbia one of the most productive environments on the continent for human habitation. The cultures of this region, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and their predecessors, built permanent villages of substantial size, maintained complex social hierarchies, developed elaborate ceremonial traditions, and accumulated wealth on a scale that impressed early European observers. The physical record of this history is extraordinary. The shell middens along the Fraser River Delta, Burrard Inlet, and the surrounding coastline represent accumulations of thousands of years of occupation. The largest of these middens, when they have been studied, reveal layered records of diet, economy, technology, and environment going back 6,000 years or more. They are, in the language of archaeology, stratigraphic archives, natural filing systems in which the history of a community is recorded in the accumulated debris of daily life. The fate of most of these middens in the Vancouver area has been grim. As the city grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the middens were identified not as archaeological resources, but as construction material. The calcium-rich shell deposits were used as road fill, as building material, and as agricultural lime. The city of Vancouver was partly built on the pulverized remains of the villages that preceded it. This was not accidental. It was deliberate. The middens were systematically quarried. The human remains, tools, ceremonial objects, and structural materials contained within them were, in most cases, treated as waste. The legal framework that should have protected these sites, the Federal Indian Act, provincial heritage legislation, was either not yet in existence when the destruction began, or was not enforced when it was. The political will to protect Indigenous archaeological sites in British Columbia was not present in the settler colonial government of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In many cases, the government's explicit goal was the elimination of distinctive Indigenous cultural identity, which made the preservation of physical evidence of that identity a low priority at best. What remains in the Vancouver area, in terms of intact archaeological deposits, is a fraction of what existed before European settlement. The Musqueam village site at the south end of the modern city is one of the few that has been partially excavated and studied. The excavations there have produced material dating back several thousand years and have confirmed the long-term occupancy and cultural continuity of the Musqueam people. But the scale of what has been destroyed in the surrounding area makes any celebration of what has been saved ring somewhat hollow. The story of Vancouver's buried history is also a story of contemporary politics. In recent decades, as land development has resumed and intensified in the greater Vancouver area, conflicts over archaeological sites have become increasingly common. Development projects on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh traditional territory routinely uncover remains of their ancestors. The legal and political battles over how to handle these discoveries, whether to halt development, conduct full excavations, repatriate remains, or simply document and proceed, are ongoing and often bitter. The communities who are the descendants of the people whose remains are being found have a clear position. The remains are sacred, the sites are historically significant, and the development should stop or be redesigned to accommodate them. The development industry, and often the government, have a different position. This conflict is happening right now. Under Vancouver's streets, under its parks, under the foundations of its newest towers, the physical record of thousands of years of human civilization waits in the ground, partially intact, partially destroyed, being discovered piecemeal as the city continues to expand. The Kennewick Connection. Who was first? In 1996, two college students wading in the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, stumbled on a human skull. The subsequent investigation revealed a nearly complete human skeleton, about 9,000 years old, with skeletal characteristics that did not match the expected profile of ancestral Native American populations. The skull, in particular, had features that some physical anthropologists described as more consistent with Polynesian or even European populations than with the populations that gave rise to modern Native Americans. The Kennewick Man, or, as the Umatilla and other local tribes call him, the Ancient One, became the center of a prolonged and bitter legal dispute between the scientific establishment, which wanted to study the remains using every available technique, and the Native American communities of the region, who wanted the remains repatriated and reburied without further testing. The case worked its way through the courts for almost 2 decades before being resolved, finally, in favor of the tribes. The Ancient One was reburied in 2017. But before that happened, DNA analysis revealed something important. The Ancient One was, genetically, closely related to contemporary Native American populations. His skeletal morphology was unusual, but his genetic ancestry was consistent with the broader population of the first peoples of the Americas. The features that had initially seemed anomalous were a product of morphological variation within a single ancestral population, not evidence of separate migrations or external contact. Why does this matter for Canadian history? Because the debate over Kennewick Man is part of a broader scientific and political argument about who came to North America first, when they arrived, and by what routes. And that argument has significant implications for the history of Canada in particular, because Canada's geography means that virtually all proposed early migration routes, the coastal migration route from Asia, the interior ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, and any proposed transatlantic or trans-Pacific contact routes, pass through what is now Canadian territory. The current scientific consensus on the first peopling of the Americas is that it occurred primarily via a migration from northeastern Asia, crossing the land bridge of Beringia, the exposed continental shelf between Siberia and Alaska, sometime between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. The coastal route along the Pacific coast of North America is now believed to have been the primary pathway, with people moving south along the shoreline in watercraft, following the productive marine environment before dispersing into the continental interior. If this is correct, the first people to arrive in what is now Canada were arriving approximately 15,000 years ago, and possibly more than 20,000 years ago, based on emerging evidence from sites in South America and southern North America that appear to predate the standard timeline. These early arrivals were not proto-Indigenous people in any simple sense. They were the founding population of an entire continental civilization, the ancestors of every indigenous culture in North America, and they spent 12 to 15,000 years developing the linguistic diversity, cultural complexity, and political sophistication that Europeans encountered on arrival. The standard Canadian historical narrative gives this history one or two paragraphs, usually described as the arrival of the first peoples via the Bering Land Bridge, followed by a jump cut to European contact. What is left out is everything that happened in between. 12 to 15,000 years of human history, cultural development, ecological adaptation, political organization, and civilizational achievement that represents the vast majority of the human story in Canada. The buried evidence, archaeological sites, human remains, structural features, trade goods, is the physical record of those 12 to 15,000 years. It is under every Canadian city. It is in the ground under every major transportation corridor, every river valley, every lake shore. It has been partially excavated, partially destroyed, partially ignored. It has never been systematically studied at the scale and with the institutional commitment that its significance demands. How the history books were written. Understanding why so much of this history has been obscured requires understanding how the dominant narrative of Canadian history was constructed, and by whom, and for what purposes. The writing of Canadian history as a formal academic and national enterprise began in earnest in the second half of the 19th century, in the decades surrounding Confederation in 1867. The historians who did this work were, almost without exception, of British or French Canadian background, educated in European intellectual traditions, employed by European-founded institutions, and writing for a reading public whose assumptions about civilization, progress, and the relationship between European and non-European peoples were shaped by the racial hierarchies of Victorian thought. These historians were not, in most cases, consciously lying. They were working within a framework of assumptions so deeply embedded in their cultural and intellectual formation that they were invisible as assumptions. They appeared simply to be the way things were. The assumption that civilization begins with written records, that progress means development toward European-style political and economic organization, that the pre-contact history of indigenous peoples is background rather than history. These were not positions that required argument or defense. They were the default. The consequences for historical writing were systematic. Events from European records were treated as history. Events known only from indigenous oral traditions were treated as legend or myth. European-derived institutions were treated as the founding of Canada. Indigenous political institutions that preceded them by centuries were treated as obstacles to be cleared. The arrival of Europeans was treated as the beginning of the historical narrative. What came before was prehistory, a category that by definition placed it outside the scope of historical inquiry. This framing is not neutral. It is not a natural or inevitable way of organizing the study of human activity over time. It is a political choice, made by people with specific interests and specific power, and it has had consequences that have lasted for over a century. The construction of this historical narrative was accompanied by, and in many ways enabled by, the residential school system. Between the 1880s and the 1990s, the Canadian government, in partnership with various Christian churches, operated a network of residential schools to which Indigenous children were forcibly sent, separated from their families, forbidden from speaking their languages, forbidden from practicing their cultural traditions, and subjected to a regime of forced assimilation designed to make them stop being Indigenous. The first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, was explicit about the goals of this policy in parliamentary testimony in 1883. He said that the aim was to take the Indian child away from the Indian, to break the family bond, and to prevent the transmission of Indigenous culture and identity to the next generation. This was not a fringe position. It was official government policy, legislated, funded, and operated for more than a century. The residential school system killed thousands of children through disease, neglect, and violence. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which issued its final report in 2015, concluded that the residential school system constituted cultural genocide. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites beginning in 2021 brought renewed national attention to the scope of the harm, with thousands of children's remains identified at sites across the country. But the harm of the residential school system to Canadian history extends beyond the physical violence inflicted on the children who attended. Every generation of children taken from their families and forbidden from learning their languages and traditions represented a severing of the oral transmission of historical knowledge. Indigenous history in Canada was preserved and transmitted primarily through oral tradition, through stories, ceremonies, songs, and the living relationships between elders and younger generations. The residential school system was designed specifically to interrupt that transmission. It succeeded in doing so for multiple generations in many communities. This means that the rewriting of Canadian history was not just academic. It was not just a matter of which events got included in textbooks. It was an active, government-sponsored campaign to destroy the primary mechanisms through which Indigenous historical knowledge was transmitted, to replace Indigenous children's cultural identity with a Canadian identity defined by European frameworks, and to ensure that the Indigenous version of Canadian history would not survive to contradict the official version. The buried evidence under Canadian cities is buried partly because of institutional neglect, partly because of development priorities, and partly because of this: the people best positioned to interpret it, to place it in cultural context, to understand what the artifacts mean and how they relate to living traditions, were subjected to a systematic campaign to disconnect them from precisely that knowledge. The suppression of archaeological evidence. 3 cases. The general argument that Canadian history has been rewritten through omission and institutional neglect is compelling. But it becomes more powerful and more specific when illustrated with concrete cases of evidence that was found, studied, and then allowed to disappear into institutional obscurity. Here are 3. The first is the Draper site, located in what is now Pickering, Ontario, east of Toronto. The Draper site is one of the most comprehensively excavated late woodland archaeological sites in Ontario. It was a large village, occupied around 1400 CE, with a population estimated at up to 2,000 people. The village showed evidence of multiple phases of expansion. The community had grown over time, enlarging the palisade and adding longhouses in a pattern consistent with successful population growth and community development. The excavation, conducted in advance of development that would eventually destroy the site, produced an extraordinary body of data about late woodland Ontario society. The significance of Draper is in what it shows about the scale and complexity of late woodland communities. A village of 2,000 people in 1400 CE is not primitive. It is not a collection of scattered family groups. It is a settlement at the lower end of what historians are willing to call a town, and it is representative of a broader pattern of large, organized, politically complex communities across southern Ontario in the centuries before contact. The excavation of Draper produced publications and academic papers that are consulted by specialists. It has had almost no impact on the public understanding of pre-contact Ontario history. The second case is the Cheguianda site on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. In the early 1950s, Thomas E. Lee, an archaeologist with the National Museum of Canada, excavated the Cheguianda site and recovered stone tools from geological deposits that he believed dated to the end of the last ice age, potentially more than 10,000 years old, with some estimates suggesting dates as ancient as 30,000 years. If Lee's dating was correct, Cheguianda was one of the oldest human habitation sites in North America, with major implications for the timeline of human arrival in the Americas. Lee's claims were not well received. The dominant view at the time was that the Americas had been inhabited for no more than 13,000 years, and claims of greater antiquity were treated with deep skepticism. Lee found himself marginalized. He lost his position at the National Museum. His excavation collections were dispersed, and in some cases, lost. The artifacts that might have resolved the question of Cheguianda's age were not systematically studied for decades. Lee himself died in 1982, still arguing for the antiquity of the site, and still largely dismissed by the mainstream. The Cheguianda story is not simply about one archaeologist's career. It is about what happens when physical evidence challenges the accepted narrative, and the institutional response is to marginalize the evidence rather than seriously engage with it. Modern reassessment of Cheguianda has been more sympathetic to Lee's basic findings, though the extreme antiquity he claimed has not been confirmed. The site is now recognized as significant, but the decades lost to institutional hostility cannot be recovered. The third case is ongoing and contemporary. The archaeological impact of the construction of Canada's Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and related energy infrastructure projects. These projects traverse enormous distances across British Columbia and Alberta, cutting through territory that has never been comprehensively surveyed archaeologically. The pipeline route has already uncovered numerous archaeological sites and human remains. The pace of construction has in many cases outrun the pace of archaeological assessment, meaning that sites are being partially documented and then destroyed before they can be fully studied. The political dynamics here are complex. Indigenous communities along the pipeline route have raised archaeological concerns as part of a broader opposition to the project, which they contend violates their rights and treaty obligations. The federal government, as owner of the pipeline project, the Trans Mountain Corporation is a Crown corporation, has a direct conflict of interest in conducting the kind of thorough archaeological review that might significantly delay or prevent construction. The result, predictably, has been an archaeological process that moves at the speed of construction, not the speed of careful scholarship. The new science, LiDAR, GPR, and the emerging picture. Here is where the story changes, because the tools available to archaeologists have changed dramatically in the last 2 decades, and what those tools are revealing is rewriting not just Canadian history, but the history of pre-Columbian civilization across the entire continent. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses emitted from aircraft to create high-resolution, 3-dimensional maps of the ground surface. Its transformative archaeological application is that it can penetrate forest canopy and reveal the ground beneath. What this means in practice is that archaeologists can now survey large areas of densely forested land and see what is there without cutting down a single tree. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR surveys conducted over the last decade have revealed an astonishing landscape of ancient cities, agricultural fields, causeways, and earthworks that were completely invisible under the forest canopy. A civilization of extraordinary scale and sophistication, now estimated to have had a population of millions in the period around 1000 CE, has been revealed in a landscape that was previously understood to be sparsely inhabited wilderness. The implications for the history of the Americas are profound. In Canada, LiDAR surveys have been conducted over some areas of British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, with results that are still being fully processed and interpreted. In the interior of British Columbia, LiDAR mapping of areas known from oral traditions to have been inhabited before contact has revealed pit house villages of unexpected size and density. The pit house culture of the BC interior, semi-subterranean winter dwellings used by plateau cultures, produce settlements that are considerably more numerous and considerably larger than the historical record suggested. In Ontario, LiDAR surveys of areas around the Great Lakes have identified earthworks, village sites, and agricultural features that are not in the existing archaeological record. Some of these features are consistent with known woodland period settlement patterns, but significantly extend our understanding of the geographic range and population density of those cultures. Others are harder to categorize and will require ground truthing, actual excavation, to fully understand. Ground penetrating radar, GPR, provides a complementary technology. Where LiDAR maps the surface, GPR maps the subsurface, sending radar pulses into the ground and creating images of what lies below. It was GPR surveys at former residential school sites that identified the unmarked graves that made headlines beginning in 2021, confirming what Indigenous communities had long been saying, that children had died in these schools and been buried without notification of their families, using physical evidence that the government could not dispute. GPR is also being used at archaeological sites across Canada, identifying buried features, walls, floors, fire pits, storage pits, burials, without the need for excavation. At the McGill University campus in Montreal, limited GPR surveys have been conducted in recent years as part of ongoing efforts to locate Hochelaga. The results have been inconclusive, partly because the depth of modern construction and soil disturbance makes it difficult to identify pre-contact features, and partly because the surveys have been limited in extent. What would happen if comprehensive LiDAR and GPR surveys were conducted across the urban cores of Canada's major cities, and if the results were fully funded for excavation and study? This question has never been seriously asked at the policy level in Canada, because it would require treating the buried history of pre-contact civilization as a national priority, equivalent to other forms of heritage preservation. That level of political commitment does not yet exist, but the science is advancing regardless. Drone-based LiDAR platforms are making it possible to survey difficult terrain at lower cost. AI-assisted analysis of LiDAR and GPR data is making it faster to identify archaeologically significant features in large datasets. DNA analysis from ancient remains is becoming more sensitive and more informative, allowing the reconstruction of detailed population histories from increasingly small sample sizes. The picture that is emerging from this new science is not the picture that was taught in Canadian schools for the past century. It is a picture of a continent that was more densely populated, more politically organized, more economically sophisticated, and more interconnected than the standard historical narrative has ever acknowledged. It is a picture in which Canada's pre-contact history is not background, not prehistory, not a brief acknowledgement before the real story begins. It is a story of extraordinary human achievement, stretching back 12,000 years and occupying every significant piece of landscape in the country. The evidence is still there. The ground beneath us has not forgotten what we tried to make it forget. The Great Lakes, a trading world beneath the surface. There is one more piece of this story that deserves its own space, because it is both deeply Canadian and deeply obscured. The Great Lakes system, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, is the largest surface freshwater system on Earth.
It contains more than 20% of the world's fresh surface water. Its shores, its waterways, and the rivers that connect it to the broader continental drainage system have been one of the most important human landscapes in North America for as long as people have been here. The archaeology of the Great Lakes is a study in what happens when commercial and industrial development proceed without adequate historical protection. The lake's shorelines were the sites of permanent settlements for thousands of years before contact. The river mouths, the places where rivers enter the lakes, were particularly important. They provided sheltered harbor, access to both lake and river resources, and the starting points for portage routes into the interior. Every major Canadian city on the Great Lakes, Toronto, Hamilton, Windsor, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, sits at or near one of these strategic river mouth locations. The development of these cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries proceeded with no meaningful archaeological protection for the sites beneath them. The shorelines were altered by lake filling. The river mouths were dredged and channelized. Entire neighborhoods were built over what had been, in some cases, the sites of significant long-term settlements. The physical record of thousands of years of human activity at these locations was largely destroyed before it could be studied. What has been found, through accident, through development-related discovery, through the small number of systematic investigations that have been conducted, consistently confirms the scale and continuity of Great Lakes Indigenous settlement. Longhouse villages, burial grounds, trade goods from distant sources, evidence of intensive agricultural production along the lake margins. All of these things have been found, documented, and in most cases subsumed by the continued expansion of the cities built on top of them. The underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes is a largely unexplored frontier. The lake's cold, fresh, low-oxygen water is exceptionally well suited to the preservation of organic material. Wooden objects that would decay within decades on land can survive for centuries or millennia underwater. In the period immediately after the retreat of the glaciers, the lake levels were significantly different from today, meaning that areas now submerged were at various times dry land. The shorelines of the ancient lakes, where people camped and fished and traveled, are now underwater. The archaeological record of the oldest human occupation of the Great Lakes region may literally be lying on the lakebed, perfectly preserved, waiting to be found. The technology to do this archaeology exists. Remotely operated vehicles, sonar mapping, and underwater excavation techniques
have been used successfully in marine archaeology around the world. The application of these technologies to the Great Lakes has barely begun. The resources devoted to it, relative to the scale of what might be found, are trivial. The Great Lakes story is a microcosm of the larger argument. The evidence is there. The technology to find it exists. The resources to study it could be allocated. What has been missing, for the entire history of Canadian archaeology, is the political will to treat the pre-contact history of this country as something worth finding, worth protecting, and worth knowing. The Wendat Confederacy, Canada's other great democracy. While the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the most widely discussed example of pre-contact Indigenous political sophistication in northeastern North America, it was not the only one. To its north, occupying the fertile agricultural land between Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe, in what is now Ontario's Simcoe County, there existed a confederacy of equal, and in some respects, greater complexity. The Wendat Confederacy, known to the French as the Huron Confederacy, and to the English sometimes as the Huron, was a political alliance of 4, and later 5, nations that maintained one of the most sophisticated governance systems in North America, and supported one of the densest agricultural populations in the northeastern part of the continent. At the height of Wendat power and organization, roughly from 1400 CE to 1650 CE, the population of Wendake, the Wendat homeland, has been estimated at between 20 and 40,000 people. This estimate is, importantly, based on incomplete evidence and may be conservative. The Wendat practiced intensive corn agriculture, growing and storing enough food to sustain large populations through the long Ontario winters, and their villages were among the largest in northeastern North America. The largest Wendat communities in the 17th century are estimated to have had populations of 1,500 to 2,000 people, comparable to significant European towns of the same period. The Wendat governance system operated through a council structure that required consensus for major decisions. Each village sent delegates to district councils. District councils sent delegates to the National Wendat Council. Decisions affecting the Confederacy as a whole required the agreement of all member nations. The system was slow by the standards of autocratic governance, but it was extraordinarily resilient, because decisions that emerged from it had the genuine buy-in of the communities they affected. The diplomatic protocols that governed council proceedings were elaborate, carefully maintained, and passed down through specialized knowledge keepers. The Wendat Confederacy was also, at the time of European contact, the dominant commercial power in northeastern North America. Their location in the fertile agricultural zone of southern Ontario, combined with their extensive trade networks, made them the middlemen of the continental economy. Wendake exported agricultural produce, corn, squash, tobacco, hemp, northward to the Algonquian-speaking hunting peoples of the Canadian Shield, and imported furs and other northern products in return. They maintained trade relationships with the Haudenosaunee to the south, with the Algonquins to the east, and with the neutral nation between them and the Haudenosaunee. Their trade network was old, established, and based on generations of maintained relationships. When the French arrived in the early 17th century and began to establish the fur trade as the economic foundation of New France, they were not creating a commercial system from scratch. They were inserting themselves into an existing one. Samuel de Champlain's alliance with the Wendat, which became the cornerstone of French colonial policy in North America, was not the creation of a trading partnership between a sophisticated European commercial culture and a primitive pre-commercial people. It was a negotiation between two sovereign commercial entities, one of which happened to have guns, and the other of which happened to control the economic geography of the interior. The catastrophe that overtook the Wendat Confederacy between 1634 and 1650 is one of the most devastating events in Canadian history,
and one of the least understood by the general public. Beginning in the 1630s, a series of epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through Wendat, introduced partly through contact with French missionaries and traders. The epidemics killed approximately half the population in the space of a decade. Simultaneously, the Haudenosaunee, responding to the depletion of their own fur-bearing animals and seeking direct access to European trade goods, launched a series of military campaigns against the Wendat that escalated into a sustained war. By 1649 and 1650, the Wendat homeland was in collapse. Major villages were attacked and burned. Large numbers of Wendat fled, some north and east to Quebec, where they eventually established the community of Wendat near Quebec City, some west, eventually becoming the Wyandot people of Ohio, Michigan, and Kansas, some into adoption by the Haudenosaunee nations that had defeated them. The physical settlements of Wendat, the longhouse villages, the agricultural fields, the elaborate burial sites called ossuaries, were abandoned and began the slow process of returning to forest. The archaeological record of Wendat is among the most extensively studied in Canada. The Wendat region corresponds to one of the most intensively developed agricultural areas of modern Ontario, and the construction of farms, roads, and suburban sprawl around the Barrie and Midland areas over the past 2 centuries has produced an enormous number of incidental archaeological discoveries. The work of archaeologist Andrew Heidenreich in the 20th century, and subsequent researchers, has documented dozens of Wendat village sites and produced a detailed picture of the culture's development over several centuries. But the Wendat story in Canadian public history remains deeply inadequate. Sainte Marie. Among the Hurons, the reconstructed Jesuit mission near Midland, Ontario, is one of the most visited historical sites in the province. It tells the story of French Jesuit missionaries in Wendat territory, admirably, and with increasing sensitivity to Indigenous perspectives. But the site and the story it tells are fundamentally organized around the French presence. The Wendat themselves, the civilization that existed for centuries before the Jesuits arrived, and whose remains lie buried in the surrounding fields in quantities that dwarf the French archaeological record, are in the story as the context for the French adventure, rather than as its main subject. The ossuaries of Wendat country are in themselves one of the most remarkable aspects of a remarkable culture. Every 10 to 15 years, the Wendat practiced the Feast of the Dead, a ceremony in which the remains of all community members who had died since the last feast were disinterred from their individual graves, cleaned and prepared by family members, and reburied communally in a large ossuary pit. The ceremony was one of the most important in the Wendat calendar, a profound communal act of mourning and memory that bound the living to the dead and to each other. Dozens of these ossuaries have been found in the Wendat region, each containing the remains of hundreds or thousands of individuals. They are among the most significant archaeological sites in Canada. Some have been excavated and studied. Many have been destroyed by development. The bones of the Wendat lie under the cornfields and subdivisions and highway corridors of Simcoe County, and the scale of what is buried there has never been fully reckoned with. The Metis and the civilization the textbooks call a rebellion. In the year 1869, the Canadian government purchased, or believed it had purchased, an enormous tract of land from the Hudson's Bay Company. The land was called Rupert's Land, and it comprised most of what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of several other provinces. The Canadian government's plan was to survey the land, open it to settlement, and incorporate it into the new Canadian Confederation. There was a problem. The land was not empty. It was home to a people whose identity, culture, and civilization had been developing for 200 years, and who had not been consulted about the transaction and had not given consent to it. The Métis people, descendants of the unions between European fur traders and Indigenous women, primarily Cree and Ojibwe,
had built a civilization in the Red River Valley around what is now Winnipeg that was economically sophisticated, politically organized, and culturally distinct from both the European and Indigenous societies that had given rise to it. The history of the Métis is usually taught in Canadian schools through the frame of the two Riel resistances, the Red River Resistance of 1869-70 and the Northwest Resistance of 1885. Louis Riel is presented as a controversial figure, a defender of Métis rights to some, a traitor to others, executed by the Canadian government in November 1885 after being convicted of high treason. The broader civilization that produced him, and the way in which that civilization was systematically destroyed by Canadian government policy, receives comparatively little attention. What the standard account misses is that the Métis were not simply a community defending land rights. They were defending a civilization. The Métis buffalo hunters of the plains had developed, over 2 centuries, an economy and a social organization built around the Great Plains bison herds. The bison hunt was the organizing principle of Métis economic life, conducted twice a year, in summer and fall, with a military precision that impressed even hostile observers. The hunts were governed by a detailed set of rules, enforced by elected officers, that prevented individual hunters from breaking ranks and driving the herd before the coordinated attack. The rules applied equally to everyone. The hunts were efficient, disciplined, and productive, yielding tons of dried and processed meat and pemmican that fed not just the Métis communities, but the entire fur trade enterprise. The social organization of the Métis combined Indigenous kinship structures with elements of the European Catholic community and produced something genuinely new, a culture with its own language, Michif, a blend of Cree and French, its own distinctive arts, its own musical traditions, its own flag, the infinity symbol on a blue background, one of the oldest national flags in North America, and its own governance traditions. The provisional government that Louis Riel established in 1869-70, however temporary and however contested, was not a spontaneous improvisation. It was the expression of an existing political culture applied to a specific crisis. The Canadian government's response to the Métis was to dispossess them. The Manitoba Act of 1870, which brought Manitoba into Confederation, included provisions for Métis land grants, scrip, that were, in practice, systematically defrauded. Land speculators followed the government surveys, buying up Métis scrip for pennies on the dollar from people who had no experience with the document-based land title system being imposed. Within a generation, most Métis families in Manitoba had lost the land they had occupied for decades. Pushed westward to Saskatchewan, the Métis tried to establish themselves again, only to face the same process: government surveys, ignored petitions, broken promises, and finally the military campaign of 1885 that ended at Beothuk and on the gallows in Regina. The Northwest Mounted Police and the Canadian militia did not just defeat an armed resistance. They destroyed the last independent Métis political community in Canada. The civilization that had been building since the late 17th century was not gradually assimilated. It was deliberately crushed. The archaeological and physical record of Métis civilization in the Canadian West is beginning to receive the attention it deserves. The National Historic Site at Beothuk preserves the physical landscape of the last Métis resistance, and ongoing archaeological work there has documented the physical evidence of the battle and of the community that preceded it. In Winnipeg, the archaeology of the Red River settlement is being increasingly integrated into the interpretation of the city's history. Métis community organizations across the prairies are working to document historic sites, recover artifacts, and ensure that the physical record of their civilization is preserved. But the fundamental rewriting of Métis history, the reduction of a 2-century civilization to a pair of rebellions by a charismatic leader, persists in the standard educational narrative. The buried evidence of Métis civilization is buried not primarily in the ground, though some of it is. It is buried in a characterization of Métis history that treats the Metis as actors in Canadian history, rather than as architects of their own civilization, temporarily occupying the stage before the real story of Canadian nationhood takes over. Oral traditions as historical evidence. The science is catching up. There is a particular dismissiveness in the Western historical tradition toward oral knowledge. If it was not written, if it was not recorded in a document that can be located in an archive and cited in a footnote, it is not, in the strictest sense of academic historiography, historical evidence. It is myth, legend, tradition, valuable perhaps as cultural artifact, but not reliable as the record of actual events. This dismissiveness has been used, explicitly and implicitly, to devalue Indigenous historical knowledge throughout the history of Canadian scholarship. When the Haudenosaunee described the founding of their confederacy in terms that include a specific solar eclipse, that account was treated as symbolic or legendary. When coastal BC nations describe a great flood in their oral traditions, that account was treated as mythological. When Indigenous communities across Canada describe the locations of their ancestors' villages, burial grounds, and sacred sites in terms passed down through oral tradition for generations, those descriptions are frequently treated as less reliable than the written records produced by European observers who spent at most a few years in the area. The problem with this dismissiveness is that it is not supported by the evidence. Repeated comparisons of oral historical accounts with independently verifiable physical evidence have found a degree of accuracy that is difficult to explain without crediting the transmission process with genuine historical reliability. The solar eclipse embedded in the Haudenosaunee founding tradition is one example. Astronomers have calculated that the eclipse that matches the description in the oral tradition would have occurred in either 1142 or 1451 CE. Both dates place the founding of the Confederacy before European contact. The oral tradition was transmitted over centuries and preserved a specific astronomical event as a temporal marker, with enough precision that modern scientists could identify the actual occurrence it describes. The great flood traditions of many coastal and river valley Indigenous cultures are another. As sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, significant areas of coastline were inundated. The Fraser River Delta, the St. Lawrence Estuary, the coastlines of Atlantic Canada, all of these were transformed by rising sea levels over a period of centuries to millennia. The oral traditions of many cultures in these regions describe massive floods, the transformation of landscapes, the loss of land that was previously inhabited. These accounts are consistent with what the physical and geological record shows. They are not metaphors. They are historical accounts of real events transmitted over 10,000 years. Archaeological findings in British Columbia have produced perhaps the most striking recent example of this correspondence. In 2017, marine archaeologists diving off the coast of Haida found evidence of human habitation on what is now the seafloor. Stone tools and other artifacts in deposits dating to the period when the area was dry land, more than 10,000 years ago. The Haida people have oral traditions that describe their ancestors living in areas that are now underwater. The archaeological findings confirm the oral history. What had been dismissed as myth turned out to be a 10,000-year-old historical record. The implications of this for Canadian historical scholarship are significant. If Indigenous oral traditions have been demonstrated to preserve accurate information across periods of thousands of years, then the body of historical knowledge encoded in those traditions is a primary historical source, not a secondary or decorative one. The knowledge held by elders and knowledge keepers across Canada is not background to the archaeological record. In many cases, it is the best guide we have to what the archaeological record means. This recognition is slowly making its way into Canadian archaeological and historical practice. Collaborative approaches, in which Indigenous communities are not just consulted about, but are active participants in the design and conduct of archaeological research, are producing better results than the old model of academic researchers conducting investigations of Indigenous sites without meaningful engagement with living descendant communities.
The knowledge that communities bring to the interpretation of archaeological findings, the oral traditions, the ceremonial practices, the ecological knowledge that connects physical artifacts to cultural meaning is not noise, it is signal. The rewriting of Canadian history that is now underway, the painful, contested, necessary project of incorporating Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge into a more complete national narrative, requires taking oral historical traditions seriously as historical evidence. Not uncritically, not without comparison to physical and documentary evidence, but seriously, as the record of human experience that it actually is. The ground and the tradition are both telling the same story. We just haven't been listening to both of them at the same time. The Arctic peoples, the history nobody knows. Perhaps the most thoroughly excluded chapter in the standard Canadian historical narrative is the history of the Arctic. When most Canadians think about the history of the Canadian North, the vast territory that makes up approximately 60% of the country's land area, they think about European exploration, the search for the Northwest Passage, the Franklin expedition, the heroic struggles of men against ice. The Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit and their predecessors, appear in this narrative primarily as helpers, guides, and observers of the European drama. The actual history of the Arctic is a story of extraordinary human achievement, stretching back at least 4,000 years, involving multiple distinct cultures whose technological ingenuity, ecological knowledge, and social organization allowed them to thrive in one of the Earth's harshest environments. It is a history almost entirely absent from Canadian public historical consciousness. The Dorset culture, named for Cape Dorset on Baffin Island, where their artifacts were first described by archaeologists, occupied the Arctic regions of Canada and Greenland from approximately 800 BCE to 1200 CE. They were not the first people in the Arctic. The Arctic small tool tradition that preceded them extended back to at least 2500 BCE. But they were the culture that developed the most sophisticated pre-Thule Arctic lifestyle, including the technologies that allowed year-round survival in the high Arctic. Insulated snow houses, sophisticated sea mammal hunting from sea ice, kayaks and large skin boats, and an elaborate material culture including some of the most remarkable sculptural art in pre-Columbian North America. The Dorset sculptural tradition produced small objects, carved from ivory, bone, and occasionally soapstone, that are among the most aesthetically striking artifacts in the Canadian archaeological record. The faces, animals, and abstract forms they created have a quality of psychological intensity and artistic sophistication that continues to impress art historians and museum visitors. They are also profoundly underrepresented in the public historical imagination. Most Canadians would not recognize a Dorset carving if they saw one, and many have never heard of the Dorset culture at all. The Dorset culture ended, apparently rather abruptly, around 1200 to 1300 CE. The cause of their disappearance has been debated for decades. The leading explanation involves the arrival of the Thule culture, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, from Alaska, spreading eastward across the Arctic with a technological package that included large skin boats, dog sleds capable of rapid travel over sea ice, and hunting technologies adapted to the bowhead whale, the largest prey animal in the Arctic ecosystem. Thule technology was more productive than Dorset technology in the specific ecological conditions of the 13th century Arctic, which was experiencing the warmth of the medieval warm period, when sea ice conditions favored the hunting strategies that the Thule had developed for open water environments. Whether the Dorset were displaced by the Thule through violent conflict, absorbed through intermarriage and cultural assimilation, or simply outcompeted economically, is a question that the physical evidence has not definitively resolved. Some locations show evidence of violent conflict. Others show possible evidence of contact and exchange. Genetic analysis of ancient Dorset and Thule remains has found that the two populations were not closely related, and that modern Inuit populations show little or no Dorset ancestry, suggesting that the Dorset were largely replaced rather than absorbed. The Thule culture, which spread across the Canadian Arctic and Greenland between approximately 1000 and 1300 CE, encountered Norse settlers in Greenland during this period. The contact between Thule and Norse peoples is documented in the archaeological record of both cultures. Norse artifacts appear in Thule sites in Canada, and there is physical evidence of face-to-face encounters. The nature of this contact, whether primarily peaceful trade, intermittent violence, or sustained interaction of a more complex kind, is still being worked out from the evidence. What the Norse-Thule contact suggests, crucially, is that the peoples of the Canadian Arctic were not passive inhabitants of a remote and isolated wilderness. They were active participants in the broader world of the late medieval period, engaging with the Norse settlers of Greenland in a dynamic that both cultures shaped and both cultures were changed by. The Greenlandic Norse colony, which survived from approximately 986 CE to the early 15th century before being abandoned, owed its survival in significant part to knowledge, technologies, and trade relationships developed through contact with the Inuit. The Inuit and their Thule predecessors were not the Arctic's primitive inhabitants. They were, in the specific ecological and climatic context of the medieval Arctic, the more sophisticated and adaptable civilization. The physical record of the Dorset and Thule cultures is scattered across the Canadian Arctic in quantities that have been only partially surveyed and studied. Melting permafrost, accelerated by climate change, is now exposing archaeological material that was frozen for centuries, and destroying it within years as the organic material that preserved it in permafrost rapidly decomposes on exposure to warmth and air. The race to document Arctic archaeological sites before they are destroyed by climate change is one of the most urgent preservation projects in Canadian archaeology, and it is not receiving anything close to the resources it needs. Under the tundra of the Canadian North, preserved by cold that is now retreating, is a material record of 4,000 years of Arctic civilization. That record is not background. It is not an appendix to the story of European Arctic exploration. It is the story of how human beings solved the problem of living at the edge of the habitable world, and solved it with ingenuity, artistry, and extraordinary success. It is Canadian history, and it is melting. The Plains civilizations, what the buffalo runs really tell us. When most people picture pre-contact life on the Canadian Plains, the vast grassland territory of what is now southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, they picture the popular image of the nomadic buffalo hunter, a solitary rider, mounted on horseback, pursuing bison across an endless prairie. This image has become so embedded in North American cultural iconography that it functions as a kind of visual shorthand for all pre-contact Plains culture. It is also, in important ways, historically misleading. The horse did not arrive on the Canadian Plains until the late 17th or early 18th century, brought northward from Spanish colonial New Mexico through a series of trades and thefts and raids that spread the animal from one indigenous community to the next over the course of several decades. Before the horse, the Plains cultures of Canada were pedestrian societies. They traveled and hunted on foot, using dogs as pack animals.
This is not, as it might sound, a significant limitation on cultural complexity. The pedestrian plains cultures of the centuries before the horse developed sophisticated technologies and social organizations for hunting bison at scale that produce some of the most remarkable archaeological features in Canada. The buffalo jump, in Blackfoot, Piskun, meaning deep blood kettle, is a hunting technology that involved driving entire herds of bison over cliff edges, where they were killed or incapacitated by the fall, and then processed by hunters waiting below. The logistics of a successful buffalo jump required extraordinary coordination. Scouts had to locate a suitable herd. Runners had to position themselves along a corridor, sometimes several kilometers long, to direct the herd's movement toward the cliff. The approaching herd had to be managed carefully to maintain the necessary panic and momentum without breaking out of the funnel. The hunters waiting at the base had to process hundreds of animals quickly before the carcasses spoiled. None of this is possible without long preparation, established protocols, shared knowledge, and a community large enough to staff every role in the operation. The buffalo jump was not an improvised hunt. It was a planned industrial operation, conducted according to techniques passed down through generations, requiring the coordinated effort of a community organized specifically around the capacity to execute it. Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta is the oldest, largest, and best preserved buffalo jump site in the world. It has been in use, according to the archaeological evidence, for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years. The logistics of a successful buffalo jump were understood and refined at this single location for 6,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded European history. Head Smashed In is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of a small number of pre-contact Indigenous archaeological sites in Canada to receive that designation. Even so, the scale of what it represents is rarely communicated in terms that convey its true significance. The bone deposits at the base of the jump, accumulated over 6 millennia of use, extend to a depth of approximately 10 meters. In those 10 meters is a complete stratigraphic record of human activity, climate, and ecology on the Canadian plains, stretching back to a period before the Egyptian pyramids. Archaeologists have identified dozens of distinct occupation layers. The bone deposits record not just the hunting activity, but the environmental history. The species composition of the bison herds changed over time in ways that reflect climate shifts. The hunting technologies evolved. The cultural material associated with different periods of use reflects the succession of different cultural traditions across 6,000 years. This is the buried evidence of the Canadian plains. Not under a city, under a field. Under the surface of a landscape that has been grazed, cultivated, and industrially farmed for a century and a half, destroying much of the surface archaeological record while leaving the deep deposits intact beneath the plow zone. The 10 meters of bone at Head Smashed In is the visible and studied example. There are dozens of other jump sites on the Canadian plains that have been partially surveyed and studied. There are hundreds more that exist in the archaeological literature as points on a map, identified but not excavated, waiting. Beyond the buffalo jumps, the plains cultures of pre-contact Canada left a landscape of features that are only now being properly documented through aerial and satellite survey. Stone circles, the remains of teepee rings, the stone weights used to hold down the edges of teepee coverings, are scattered across the plains in enormous numbers. Surveys of specific areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan have found densities of teepee rings suggesting levels of occupation significantly higher than the historical record had indicated. Ceremonial cairns, medicine wheels, and vision quest sites are distributed across the landscape in patterns that reflect organized use of the plains environment over centuries and millennia. The medicine wheel at Majorville in Alberta is one of the oldest continuously maintained ceremonial sites in North America. The central cairn at its hub has been dated to approximately 5,000 years ago. The spoke and rim pattern of the wheel has been altered and maintained at various points over those 5 millennia, making it a site of continuous ceremonial use, covering a span of time comparable to the entire history of ancient Egypt, from its founding to its fall. Majorville is not a household name in Canadian cultural history. Most Canadians have never heard of it. It receives a fraction of the preservation attention and public interpretation resources allocated to far younger and culturally less significant European heritage sites. The economic foundation of Plains civilization before the horse was the bison, and the scale of the relationship between Plains peoples and bison herds is one of the most extraordinary ecological partnerships in human history. The Plains bison population at its peak has been estimated at between 30 and 60 million animals. The management of those herds, for that is what the buffalo jumps and the associated drives and impoundments represent, management, not just hunting, was the economic foundation of a civilization that extended from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian subarctic, and that supported a population, estimated across the entire Plains culture area, of several million people. The near total destruction of the Plains bison herds in the 1870s and 1880s was not an accident of settlement. It was, in significant part, deliberate policy. American military officers, and, by extension, Canadian officials, recognized that the destruction of the bison would force the Plains nations into dependence on government rations and would break their capacity for resistance. General Philip Sheridan of the United States Army explicitly encouraged the commercial slaughter of the herds, famously suggesting that the hide hunters, who were killing millions of bison, were doing more to solve the Indian problem than the Army could do in 30 years. Within a decade, herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were reduced to a few hundred animals, confined to small protected areas. The destruction of the bison was the destruction of the material foundation of Plains civilization. It was an act of economic warfare, conducted simultaneously with military campaigns, forced relocation to reserves, and the imposition of the residential school system. The Blackfoot, Cree, Nakota, Lakota, and all the other nations of the Plains did not become dependent on government rations because of any cultural failure or any incapacity to support themselves. They became dependent because the resource base that had sustained their civilization for millennia was deliberately obliterated in the span of a decade. The physical evidence of the Plains civilizations, the buffalo jumps, the teepee rings, the medicine wheels, the piscoon structures, the bone deposits, the trail systems worn deep into the prairie soil by generations of bison and the people who followed them, is being erased by agriculture, oil and gas development, road construction, and the straightforward neglect that comes from not caring what is being lost. Remote sensing and satellite archaeology are now identifying features that ground surveys would never have found, but the pace of identification is, in many areas, slower than the pace of destruction. The Canadian Plains supported a civilization of extraordinary productivity, ecological sophistication, and cultural richness for thousands of years before European contact and into the contact period. The buffalo hunters, whose images have been romanticized in 100 paintings and films, were not primitive nomads living on the margin of subsistence. They were the inheritors of a 6,000-year tradition of resource management, the practitioners of a complex and highly efficient economic system, and the members of nations with sophisticated political and diplomatic traditions. What was done to them and to the civilization they maintained was not the inevitable consequence of contact with a more advanced culture. It was a series of deliberate political, economic, and military choices made by Canadian and American governments to destroy a civilization that stood in the way of settler expansion. The evidence of what that civilization was and what it achieved is buried across the Canadian plains. In the bone deposits of the buffalo jumps, in the soil stains of teepee rings, in the alignments of medicine wheels that mark seasonal passages and ceremonial occasions stretching back 5,000 years.
In the ground, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for the decision that it deserves to be found. Reconciliation and the archaeological record. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada issued a set of 94 calls to action. Among them, Call to Action number 65 called on the federal government to establish a National Council for Reconciliation. Call to Action number 77 called for adequate, stable, and consistent funding for Indigenous languages. Call to Action number 62 called for a national review of the residential school system and its ongoing legacy. Archaeology does not appear prominently in the calls to action. The physical record of pre-contact civilization, the buried cities, the ancient mines, the village sites and burial grounds and trade goods, is not explicitly identified as a site of reconciliation work, but it should be. There is a profound connection between the political project of reconciliation and the archaeological project of recovering Canada's buried history. Both are attempts to correct a fundamental misrepresentation, the idea that Canada's history began with European arrival, that the land was essentially empty before contact, and that the development of a modern nation on that land was a straightforward story of progress, rather than a complex and often violent story of replacement. The physical evidence in the ground does not support the simple narrative. It supports something more complex, more ancient, and more morally demanding. It supports a version of Canadian history in which the pre-contact civilizations of this land were sophisticated, organized, and valuable, not as interesting background to the main story, but as the main story, or at least as a co-equal part of a history that has always been multiple and layered. The specific language of the calls to action is worth noting here. The Commission did not frame reconciliation as a gift from settler Canada to Indigenous Canada. It framed it as a mutual obligation, a process of relationship repair that requires both sides to engage honestly with what happened and why. The archaeological record is part of that honest engagement. You cannot genuinely reckon with what was taken from Indigenous peoples if you do not understand what they had. You cannot appreciate the scale of the cultural loss imposed by the residential school system and the other mechanisms of forced assimilation if you do not understand the richness and complexity of what those mechanisms were designed to destroy. Several Canadian cities and provinces have taken steps toward a more serious engagement with the archaeological record of pre-contact history. British Columbia's archaeological legislation is among the strongest in Canada, with requirements for archaeological impact assessments before major development projects and protocols for Indigenous consultation and oversight. Ontario has been slower to update its regulatory framework, though there are ongoing legislative discussions about strengthening protection for Indigenous heritage sites. At the federal level, the pace of change has been frustratingly slow. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and related legislation have been reformed multiple times in recent decades, with varying degrees of attention to archaeological and heritage protection. The fundamental tension between development imperatives and heritage protection has not been resolved, and without political pressure to resolve it, it probably won't be. What would a genuine commitment to recovering Canada's buried history look like? It would look like comprehensive archaeological surveys before any major development project, not the limited assessments currently required. It would look like dedicated funding for the study of existing collections,
the artifacts and records from past excavations that sit unstudied in museum storage rooms and university repositories across the country. It would look like investment in the training of Indigenous archaeologists who can bring both scientific methods and cultural knowledge to the interpretation of the physical record. It would look like the integration of archaeological findings into school curricula, not as a footnote to European exploration, but as the foundation of Canadian history. It would look, in other words, like taking seriously the proposition that the history of Canada begins not in 1534 or 1497 or 1000 CE, but 12,000 years ago, when the first people walked into this landscape and began the long process of understanding it, shaping it, and making it home. The weight of what we don't know. There is a particular kind of loss that is different from other losses. It is the loss of knowledge, not the loss of things, though things are lost too. The loss of knowledge, of understanding, of interpretation, of the human meaning behind the physical objects, is in some ways the most profound loss, because it is the most complete. When a burial site is destroyed by construction without adequate study, what is lost is not just the physical remains of the people buried there. What is lost is the possibility of understanding who those people were, how they lived, what they believed, what relationships they maintained, what history they carried. The bones can be documented, the artifacts can be photographed, but the context, the meaning that arises from the relationship between objects, between people, between a community and its landscape, that context is lost permanently when the site is destroyed. Canada has been losing that context for 200 years. The losses are so numerous and so distributed that they don't register as a single catastrophe. They register as background noise, as the normal cost of development and progress, as the inevitable consequence of a growing modern society building on top of its predecessors, but accumulated across the entire history of the country, across the hundreds of thousands of development projects that have occurred without adequate archaeological study, the loss is staggering. We do not know how many people lived in pre-contact Canada. The estimates range from 500,000 to over 2 million, with the true figure probably somewhere in that range, and impossible to determine precisely, given the limitations of the evidence. We do not know the full extent of the trade networks that connected the cultures of this region to the rest of the continent. We do not know the complete linguistic history of the hundreds of languages spoken here before contact, most of which are now endangered or extinct. We do not know what Hochelaga looked like from the inside, what its political structure was, what ceremonies its people practiced, or why it disappeared so completely in the 70 years between Cartier and Champlain. We don't know because we haven't looked, or rather, because the institutional infrastructure for looking has been consistently underfunded, undersupported, and undervalued. The choice not to fund comprehensive archaeological study in Canada is a choice. It is made repeatedly by governments with other priorities in a political environment that does not demand better. But the ground keeps its secrets imperfectly. Every construction project is a potential revelation. Every storm that erodes a riverbank is a potential discovery. The artifacts keep working their way to the surface, keep being uncovered by chance, keep demanding to be noticed. And the new technologies, LiDAR and GPR and ancient DNA and isotopic analysis, are making it possible to learn things that previous generations of archaeologists could not have imagined learning. The history is not gone. It is buried. There is a difference. Conclusion. Let's end where we began. Under the streets of every major Canadian city,
there is evidence of a history that the textbooks do not tell. Not the history of European settlement, which is told extensively, if not always honestly. The history of what came before. The 12,000 years of human civilization, political organization, cultural achievement, economic sophistication, and ecological knowledge that preceded the arrival of Europeans, and that continued, in transformed and diminished but never extinguished form, after they arrived. This history was not accidentally omitted from the national narrative. It was structurally excluded by a combination of intellectual assumptions, institutional priorities, deliberate government policy, and the brute force of colonial development that destroyed physical evidence faster than it could be recovered. The residential school system was the most violent expression of this exclusion, but it was not the only one. Every poorly funded archaeological survey, every development project allowed to proceed without adequate study, every school curriculum that treats pre-contact history as a brief forward to the real story. These are all expressions of the same fundamental devaluation. The devaluation is not permanent. It is not irreversible. The evidence that remains in the ground is still there, still waiting, still capable of being found and studied and incorporated into a more complete and more honest account of what happened on this land and who made it what it is. The Indigenous nations of Canada have never accepted the version of history that excluded them. They have maintained oral traditions, ceremonies, place names, and relationships with the land that encode historical knowledge going back centuries, and in many cases, millennia. They have fought, in courts and in legislatures and in the streets, for recognition of their history, their rights, and their continued presence. The reconciliation process, whatever its limitations, represents an acknowledgement that the official version of Canadian history is incomplete, and that completing it is a national responsibility. What the physical evidence, the archaeological record buried under every Canadian city, adds to this project is something irreplaceable. It adds specificity. It adds scale. It adds the ability to say, here, this specific place, this specific community, these specific people, this specific time. The generalized acknowledgement that Indigenous people were here before Europeans is necessary but insufficient. The archaeological record, where it has been recovered, provides something more powerful. The individual and particular evidence of individual and particular lives, lived with sophistication and meaning, in a landscape that was already deeply and completely human before the Europeans named it new. Hochelaga is buried somewhere under Montreal. The copper miners of Lake Superior left evidence of their industry in the ground and in the genetic record of the communities that descend from them. The buried villages of Vancouver's waterfront hold the accumulated knowledge of 6,000 years. The ossuaries and longhouse sites and trade depots and agricultural fields under Toronto represent more than 10,000 years of continuous human habitation at one of the continent's most strategically important locations. The bone deposits of Head Smashed Inn represent 6,000 years of organized economic life on the plains. The Arctic tundra, melting now in ways that could not have been anticipated, is releasing the frozen record of 4,000 years of Dorset and Thule civilization into air that will destroy it within years, if no one is there to document it. The medicine wheels of southern Alberta mark out a ceremonial calendar older than Stonehenge. The Wendat ossuaries of Simcoe County hold the collective dead of a civilization that governed itself democratically, when most of Europe was governed by hereditary monarchs. This is the weight of what the ground holds. Not just in one place or two, in every part of this country. In the permafrost of the north, and the clay of the south, and the shell deposits of the coast, and the river silt of the interior. Canada is a country of layers, and the layers that matter most
the ones that tell the full story, are the ones we built on top of, rather than into. There is something almost geometrically appropriate about the phrase with which we started, 10 meters under. 10 meters is the depth of a moderately deep basement, the depth of a foundation for a large building, the depth of a serious engineering excavation. It is not very far. The history we are talking about is not remote or abstract or inaccessible. It is 10 meters beneath the ground you walk on every day. In Toronto, in Vancouver, in Montreal, in Winnipeg, in Calgary, in Ottawa. The thickness of a building's foundation is all that stands between the present and 12,000 years of continuous human civilization. This is what 10 meters of soil can hide. This is what 200 years of development can bury. This is what a national narrative built on the premise of emptiness can exclude. But the ground does not forget, and increasingly, the tools exist to make it speak. The LiDAR surveys are running. The ground-penetrating radar instruments are rolling. The ancient DNA labs are processing their samples. The archaeologists who grew up in the communities whose history is buried are bringing new eyes and new questions to the evidence. The oral traditions that were supposed to be extinguished by the residential schools are being recovered, one language and one story at a time, by communities who refuse to stop being who they are. The history of Canada did not begin in 1534. It did not begin in 1497 or 1000 CE, or 3,000 years ago when the first copper miners drove their tools into the rock at Lake Superior. It began when the first human beings walked into this landscape, looked at what was here, and decided to call it home. That was at least 12,000 years ago, possibly longer. Everything that happened between then and now is Canadian history. All of it. The buried parts included. The question is not whether this history exists. It exists. The question is whether Canada, as a nation, as a society, as a collection of institutions and governments and universities and school boards and development companies and individual citizens, is willing to do what recovering it requires. To fund the archaeology, to protect the sites, to incorporate what is found into a national story that can finally accommodate its own full complexity. That is a political question. It is an economic question. But most fundamentally, it is a question about identity, about what kind of country Canada wants to be, and what kind of history it wants to claim. If this changed how you think about the country you live in, about the ground beneath your feet, about what it means to know a place's history, and what it means not to, leave a comment. Share this with someone who has never been given reason to think about what's under the streets. Because the conversation that this evidence demands, the honest, complete, uncomfortable conversation about who was here and what was done to erase them, that conversation is the most important one Canada has to have. And we are, finally, only just beginning it.